When we think of ancient spiritual leaders, images often flood our minds. Robed figures in stone circles, mysterious priests performing rituals under moonlight. Keepers of secrets that shaped civilizations, the Druids occupy this space in our imagination. Yet perhaps more than any other spiritual class in Western history, they remain profoundly misunderstood. We know less about them from their own words than from those who oppose them. We have almost no texts written by their hands. What we know comes filtered through Roman military accounts, Christian ecclesiastical writings, and fragmentary Celtic manuscripts, preserved by the very people who systematize the suppression of Druidic knowledge. This is the paradox that makes their story so compelling. It's a history told almost entirely by their enemies and those who replaced them. The Druids were not a monolithic order with a central authority, temples, or membership roles. They were regional specialists embedded within Celtic societies, across what we now call France, Britain, Ireland, and Central Europe. They emerged gradually from the religious and intellectual landscapes of Celtic peoples around the 5th or 6th century BCE, though the precise moment remains obscured by the mists of prehistory. What makes them unique among ancient priesthoods is not just what they knew, but how they chose to preserve knowledge, or rather, how they chose not to. The Druidic order represented something radical for their time. A deliberate rejection of written transmission in favor of oral preservation. This choice fundamentally shaped everything about them. In an era when the Mediterranean civilizations were developing sophisticated writing systems and committing law, philosophy, and religious knowledge to permanent records, the Druids maintained that certain knowledge should exist only in human memory, transmitted directly from teacher to student over years or decades of intensive training. This wasn't ignorance. It wasn't inability, it was philosophy. It was a deliberate choice that would have profound consequences for how their legacy survived, and didn't survive, into the present day. We enter their world first through the eyes of their enemies. Julius Caesar, writing in the 1st century BCE after his military campaigns in Gaul, provides the most detailed surviving Roman account of Druidic practice. Caesar was not an ethnographer moved by scholarly curiosity. He was a military commander seeking to understand and ultimately conquer the peoples he encountered. His commentary De Bello Gallico describes Druids with a mixture of grudging respect and tactical concern. They held enormous political influence among the Celtic peoples he fought. They could command the obedience of kings and nobles. They adjudicated legal disputes and served as the keepers of genealogies and historical memory. More troubling to Caesar, they possessed the authority to declare that certain warriors should not fight, and their decisions were binding. A Druid could essentially veto military action through spiritual proclamation, giving them power that transcended force. What Caesar observed was a priestly class integrated into the very fabric of Celtic governance. Druids served as judges, lawmakers, teachers, healers, and spiritual advisors. They formed what we might recognize as an educated elite. Though their elite status derived from knowledge rather than birth, though birth certainly provided advantage, a young man or woman of talent could potentially enter Druidic training, though family connections made this far more likely. The training was notoriously difficult. According to some sources preserved in Irish texts, training could take 20 years or more. Students would memorize hundreds of poems, learning not just the words but their layers of meaning, the historical and spiritual references embedded within them, the magical and divinatory significance of particular phrases. The geographic spread of Druidism across Celtic territories suggests something that Roman sources sometimes missed. The Druids were not a single organization, but a broadly shared cultural institution. Druids in what is now France shared fundamental assumptions about cosmology and practice with Druids in Britain and Ireland. Yet they were not subordinate to a central authority. They maintained their influence through cultural prestige, intellectual authority, and the respect their knowledge commanded. Different regions had different practices, different emphases, yet the core commitment to oral transmission united them. They formed a class of specialists whose primary function was to maintain and transmit the accumulated wisdom of their peoples. This oral tradition was anything but primitive. The Druidic memory system relied on sophisticated mnemonic techniques. We know from later Irish sources that Druid-trained individuals could hold entire genealogies, mythological cycles, legal precedents, astronomical observations, and spiritual teachings in their minds, organized in ways that made them instantly accessible. The Irish poems and narratives that survived Christian transcription preserve traces of this system. Alliterative patterns, internal rhymes, metaphorical structures that made the material memorable, and formulaic repetition that embedded knowledge deeply. What did they actually study? Caesar mentions that Druids concerned themselves with questions of the stars, the motions of celestial bodies, the size of the world, the nature of things, and the power and authority of the gods. This is not merely mystical speculation. It's a curriculum that encompasses what we might call astronomy, cosmology, theology, and natural philosophy. Archaeological evidence confirms that Celtic peoples possessed genuine astronomical knowledge. Stone circles and alignments throughout Britain and Ireland demonstrate sophisticated understanding of celestial movements and seasonal cycles. The Druids maintained this knowledge, used it to calibrate their ritual calendar, and integrated it with their spiritual understanding of the cosmos. They studied law extensively. Celtic societies had complex legal systems, and Druids served as the guardians and interpreters of these laws. The Irish legal texts that were later written down, the Brehon Laws, preserve much older material that reflects Druidic jurisprudence. These laws covered everything from property disputes to honor violations to compensation for injuries. The Druids served as judges, arbiters, and teachers of law, their knowledge giving them influence in Celtic governance that military strength alone could not command. The central feature of Druidic practice was divination. They read omens in the flight of birds, in the entrails of animals, in the movements of clouds. They interpreted dreams and visions. They cast lots and read signs in the patterns of events. This divination was not random superstition. It was a systematic practice that served practical functions. Before a hunt, a battle, or an important decision, seeking Druidic divination allowed communities to make decisions with the sense that they had consulted all available sources of knowledge. The divination also served to reinforce Druidic authority. Their interpretations of signs and omens became self-fulfilling as people acted upon them, and then reinterpreted subsequent events as confirmations of the original reading. The seasonal rituals that structured Celtic life were overseen by Druids. The calendar followed astronomical events and celebrated transitions. Samhain at the end of October, marking the end of summer and the beginning of the Celtic New Year. Imbolc in February, celebrating the first stirring of spring and the birth of lambs. Beltane in May, honoring pastoral prosperity and involving ritual fires that symbolically purified communities and livestock. And Lugnasad in August, celebrating the beginning of harvest. These were not purely religious occasions. They were communal events that gathered people together, reinforced social bonds, marked time, and connected the human world with the rhythms of nature and the spiritual forces understood to govern them. Samhain occupies special significance in the Druidic calendar and in our understanding of Druidic cosmology. Occurring when the boundary between summer and winter blurred, Samhain was understood as a time when the normal boundaries between the living world and the otherworld grew thin. The dead could return, supernatural beings could interact with the living, and the usual rules governing reality became less fixed. Druids performed special rituals at Samhain to maintain cosmic balance and ensure safe passage through the dangerous transition. This wasn't merely superstition. It reflected a sophisticated understanding that significant transitions are inherently unstable and require ritual management. Human sacrifice appears in Roman accounts and is supported by some archaeological evidence. Bog bodies discovered across Celtic lands show evidence of ritual killing, sometimes triple deaths involving different methods. While we must be cautious about accepting every Roman claim about Celtic peoples, Roman writers often exaggerated the savagery of people they were conquering. The evidence suggests that ritual sacrifice was indeed practiced, likely in times of extreme crisis, when the community faced existential threat. These would not have been casual or frequent. They would have been extraordinary acts performed when standard divination and ritual proved insufficient. The victims were likely chosen according to ritual criteria and probably understood themselves as servants of the community's survival. This is not to justify the practice by modern standards, but to understand it within its own conceptual framework, rather than dismissing it as mere barbarism. The Druidic cosmology understood the world as structured by powerful oppositions held in tension. The Otherworld existed not as a distant heaven, but as an alternate plane of reality, accessible through specific places, mist-shrouded islands, hidden passages beneath hills, the waters of sacred lakes. The Otherworld was not the afterlife, though the dead existed there. It was a realm where time moved differently, where immortals dwelt, where the laws of the living world did not apply. A hero might spend what seemed like 3 days in the Otherworld, only to return and find centuries had passed. This concept shaped how Druids understood reality itself. The material world visible to ordinary perception was not the totality of existence, but one layer of a much more complex universe. Reincarnation formed a cornerstone of Druidic belief. Not reincarnation in an Indian sense, where souls progress toward enlightenment through many lifetimes, but rather a cycling of souls, sometimes human and sometimes animal, across incarnations. This belief had profound philosophical implications. If your enemy might be reborn as your child, it encouraged restraint. If the person in front of you might house the spirit of someone you knew generations ago, it established a different relationship to time and identity. Death was understood not as final cessation, but as transition. This belief also reinforced social stability. It made less urgent the quest for material accumulation and personal dominance if existence continued in different forms beyond death. The significance of natural features in Druidic practice cannot be overstated. Sacred trees held spiritual power and served as communal gathering places and sources of spiritual knowledge. Oak trees particularly were associated with Druidism. Indeed, some scholars suggest the word Druid itself derives from roots meaning oak knower. Each tree possessed properties understood to reflect and influence the human world. Oak represented strength and sovereignty. Yew embodied ancient wisdom and the connection between worlds. Hazel was associated with knowledge and salmon swimming in sacred pools. Druids used trees not just symbolically but practically, creating medicines from bark and berries, timing rituals to correspond with trees' seasonal cycles, and creating sacred groves where people gathered for important gatherings and rituals. Water features held equal importance. Lakes, rivers, and springs were understood as thin places where the Otherworld pressed close to the living world. Celtic peoples across multiple regions engaged in ritual deposition in water, throwing objects of value into sacred lakes and rivers as offerings. Hundreds of items have been recovered from ancient water bodies. Weapons, jewelry, cauldrons, coins. These were not careless losses. They were deliberate acts of devotion and propitiation. Druids would likely have officiated these practices, understanding the offerings as necessary transactions between human and divine. The sacred objects that appear throughout Celtic mythology and archaeology reveal Druidic values and understanding. The cauldron appears repeatedly in myths, a vessel of abundance, healing, resurrection, and transformation. The cauldron's significance was not merely symbolic. Cauldrons served as cooking vessels, ceremonial objects, and repositories of precious materials. In the otherworldly realm, magical cauldrons never emptied, fed warriors who tasted them, and restored the dead to life. This mythological emphasis on the cauldron likely reflects its central role in Druidic ritual and community life. Swords held equally profound significance, particularly swords of exceptional quality. They were not mere weapons but objects of spiritual power, sometimes with names and attributed personalities. A sword might be passed down through generations, accumulating history and spiritual weight. The sword represented sovereignty, martial prowess, and connection to the hero realm. A king's legitimacy could be questioned, but his sword was understood as carrying the authority of his lineage and the blessings of spiritual forces. Torques, rigid metal necklaces, often of gold or bronze, served as markers of status and spiritual significance. Wearing a torque signified membership in an elite class. Some torques were so valuable they might be worn only ceremonially. The rigid, circular form of the torque probably held cosmological significance. The circle representing wholeness and the cosmic order. The rigidity suggesting permanence and binding authority. The Ogham alphabet presents a particular mystery, used primarily in Ireland and parts of Britain. Ogham consists of 20 letters, each associated with a tree. Early Christian monks who preserved Ogham knowledge attributed each letter to specific meanings and properties. While we cannot be certain how Druids themselves understood Ogham, much of what we know comes from Christian sources. The systematic association of letters with natural features suggests a coherent system for encoding knowledge. Ogham might have served as a mnemonic device, a system for divination, or a sacred alphabet understood to hold magical properties. The fact that it appears on standing stones and monuments suggests it held public, not merely private, significance. Stone circles and aligned standing stones scattered across Britain and Ireland demonstrate astronomical and geometric knowledge that predates the historical Druid period, but would have been maintained and interpreted within Druidic tradition. Stonehenge, for instance, was already ancient by the time Druids emerged, but Druids likely incorporated it into their sacred geography and used it for astronomical observation and ritual purposes. These monuments served as permanent records written in stone, outlasting the human memory that normally preserved Celtic knowledge. They connected communities to ancestral practices and cosmic order, making the invisible architecture of the universe visible in the landscape. The Roman suppression of Druidism represents one of the most systematic intellectual suppressions in Western history. It wasn't haphazard or accidental. The Roman state deliberately targeted Druidic knowledge and authority. Julius Caesar had observed during his Gallic campaigns that Druids' spiritual authority prevented him from controlling conquered peoples. They could validate resistance and undermine Roman legitimacy. After the conquest, suppression became policy. The initial Roman prohibition came under the Emperor Claudius, around 50 CE. The prohibition forbade Romans from participating in Druidic practices and appears to have restricted Druidic activity in territories under direct Roman control. However, this was not a total eradication. Druidism persisted, particularly in regions beyond Roman reach. Ireland was never conquered by Rome, and Scotland remained largely independent. In areas under Roman control, Druidic practice adapted, going underground or merging with Roman religious practices. The most dramatic suppression occurred later, in 60 CE, when the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus attacked the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, which had become a center of Druidic resistance and learning. Roman forces massacred the population, burned sacred groves, and destroyed the religious establishments they found. This was not merely military conquest, but cultural genocide, aimed specifically at eliminating a knowledge system and the religious foundations of resistance. Yet, even as Rome suppressed Druidism, Roman writers preserved accounts of Druidic practice. Caesar, Tacitus, Pliny, and other Roman sources recorded information about Druids' beliefs and practices. These accounts are not neutral. They are written by men who saw Druids as obstacles to Roman expansion, but they provide the most detailed surviving descriptions we possess. This is one of history's bitter ironies. Roman military suppression preserved in writing what the Druids themselves had deliberately kept oral. The Christian conversion of Celtic lands created a more complex situation than simple suppression. Christianity spread gradually through Celtic territories, beginning in the 4th century and accelerating in the 5th and 6th centuries. In some cases, conversion was genuinely voluntary, as Christianity's message resonated with existing beliefs. In other cases, it was coercive, following political dominance. The relationship between Christianity and Druidism was not one of pure opposition. Celtic Christianity, particularly in Ireland, developed distinctive characteristics that incorporated pre-Christian elements. Pagan festivals like Samhain continued to be celebrated, Christianized but retaining their essential character. Sacred springs and wells, formerly dedicated to pagan deities, were rededicated to Christian saints, but continued to serve as sites of pilgrimage and healing. The structure and authority of the Catholic Church provided a new framework for the educated classes who had formerly been Druids. Some sons of Druidic families became priests and monks. Christianity offered a new way to exercise intellectual and spiritual authority. Irish monasteries became centers of learning that preserved not only Christian texts, but also pre-Christian Irish literature and mythology. The great cycles of Irish mythology, the Ulster cycle, the Fenian cycle, the mythological cycle, were transcribed by Christian monks who recognized them as valuable historical and cultural records. These texts preserve countless details about Druidic practice, cosmology, and authority. Without Christian monks' decision to preserve these texts, we would know almost nothing about Irish Druids beyond what Roman writers recorded about continental Celts. This preservation was not without cost or distortion. Monks Christianized what they transcribed, inserting Christian framework and moral judgments into pagan narratives. A Druid character might be portrayed as wicked or deluded. Pagan practices might be presented as superstition. Yet, beneath these Christian layers, the original material often remains recoverable. Scholars reading carefully can detect the pre-Christian substrate. What we cannot recover with certainty is everything that was lost. The oral tradition that Druids had maintained for centuries couldn't be transmitted orally anymore as Druidic society dissolved. Much knowledge simply evaporated when the last trained Druids died without passing their learning to successors. We can estimate the scale of loss when we consider that what survives about Druidic practice comes from hostile Roman accounts, ecclesiastical Christian sources, and fragmentary Irish manuscripts. What proportion of their actual knowledge and practice these sources represent is unknowable. The transformation of Druids from historical figures into legendary ones began in the medieval period. As Druidic society faded into the past, it became increasingly romanticized. Medieval writers and storytellers wove Druids into narratives where they took on more magical, less political character. Merlin, the wizard advisor of Arthurian legend, likely contains echoes of Druidic figures, though Merlin, as he appears in medieval literature, is far removed from historical Druids. The Arthurian romance tradition created a particular version of Druidism. In these stories, Druids appear as wise counselors, magical practitioners, and repositories of ancient knowledge. Merlin especially occupies a liminal space, more magical than the historical Druids appear to have been, but retaining the Druidic role of advisor to kings and keeper of secrets. Whether any historical kernel exists beneath these legendary characters remains debated among scholars. What's clear is that the medieval literary tradition transformed Druids into something different from what they had been. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries created an entirely new version of Druidism, one that tells us more about Romantic era values than about historical Druids. Romantic thinkers, reacting against industrialization and rationalism, constructed an imagined Druidic past of noble savages living in harmony with nature, possessing intuitive wisdom untainted by corrupting civilization. This imagined Druidism emphasized the mystical and magical while minimizing the political power and involvement in warfare that historical Druids actually exercised. The modern Druid revival movements that emerged in the 18th century and continued through the 20th century drew heavily on Romantic idealization. Groups like the Antediluvian Order of Druids, founded in 1781, and later Druidic organizations and modern pagan traditions, created contemporary Druidism based on scholarly sources mixed with Romantic imagination and modern spiritual seeking. These movements preserved interest in Druidism and contributed to modern scholarly attention to historical Druids, but they created versions of Druidism that would have seemed alien to an actual ancient Druid. Modern neo-Druidry comes in multiple forms. Some practitioners focus on reconstructing historical Druidic practices as accurately as possible based on available sources. Others create new spiritual practices inspired by Druidic ideas, but not claiming historical accuracy. Still, others integrate Druidic elements with other spiritual traditions. These modern movements have contributed valuable research into historical sources and have created communities that value the themes Druidism emphasizes: connection to nature, oral tradition, wisdom, and spiritual authority based on knowledge rather than institutional position. However, modern Druidry must be distinguished from historical Druidism. Historical Druids were embedded in specific Celtic societies with particular political concerns, practical functions, and beliefs that reflected their time and place. They were not primarily mystics engaged in personal spiritual seeking. They were the educated elite of their societies, exercising real power and influence. Their knowledge served practical functions. Calendrical knowledge ensured agricultural success. Divination provided decision-making frameworks. Legal knowledge maintained social order, and religious authority reinforced cultural identity. Modern Druidry, even at its most historically informed, cannot fully resurrect this because it exists in a completely different social context. What we actually know with reasonable confidence about historical Druids comes from piecing together evidence from multiple sources, each with its own biases and limitations. The Roman sources provide the most detailed accounts, but are filtered through military political concerns. The Irish manuscripts preserve mythological and literary material that reflects Druidic ideas but are transmitted through Christian scribes who edited and moralized the content. Archaeological evidence, stone circles, bog bodies, ritual deposits in water, metal objects, provides material evidence of ritual and spiritual practices, but requires interpretation about what these materials actually meant to those who created them. From these sources, we can reconstruct certain things with reasonable confidence. Druids were an educated elite who underwent lengthy training. They served multiple functions: religious specialists, judges, teachers, healers, and advisors. They maintained knowledge orally through sophisticated mnemonic techniques. They possessed genuine astronomical and mathematical knowledge integrated with spiritual understanding. They exercised real political power and influence. Their authority derived from their knowledge and their perceived connection to spiritual forces and cosmic order. They were systematically suppressed by Rome and gradually displaced by Christianity, though some of their knowledge and practices survived in modified form through Christian preservation and folk tradition. What remains fundamentally mysterious is the inner experience of being a Druid, the subjective reality of their spiritual practice. We can document that they performed divinations, but we cannot know what they understood themselves to be doing at a deep level. We know they believed in the otherworld, but we cannot access that belief from the inside. We see the shape of their practices from the outside, but the felt reality of their spirituality remains beyond our reach. This gap between what we can document and what we cannot know is not a failure of scholarship. It's an honest acknowledgement of the limits of historical knowledge when dealing with oral cultures whose knowledge was deliberately not written down. The Druids' choice to maintain oral transmission was spiritually and philosophically meaningful, but it guaranteed that their knowledge would be vulnerable to loss. In choosing to preserve knowledge in human memory rather than in durable texts, they made a choice that valued the living transmission of knowledge between teacher and student over the permanence of written record. We cannot know if they anticipated that this choice would lead to nearly complete loss of their tradition. Probably they did not. Probably they assumed that Druidic tradition would continue indefinitely, that teachers and students would pass knowledge along as they always had. That assumption proved tragically wrong. The Druids ultimately tell us something important about the fragility of knowledge and the vulnerability of oral traditions to suppression and displacement. They remind us that what we know about the past is only a fraction of what actually occurred, filtered through the perspectives of those who recorded it. They demonstrate how completely a civilization and its knowledge systems can be erased when sufficiently powerful forces oppose them, and when a culture chooses not to commit its knowledge to writing. Yet they also demonstrate the resilience of cultural memory. Despite centuries of suppression, Druidic ideas and practices leaked into Christianity, survived in folklore, influenced art and literature, and continue to inspire people seeking alternatives to dominant traditions. The Druids themselves may have vanished as a functioning class of specialists, but Druidism as a set of values, emphasizing wisdom, connection to nature, oral tradition, and spiritual knowledge, continues to appeal to people across centuries and cultures. What the Druids actually were remains partly unknowable. preserved in fragments and filtered through hostile and sympathetic sources alike. But what they represent: the possibility of wisdom preserved outside institutional structures, spiritual authority based on knowledge rather than organization, and the deep human desire to connect with forces beyond the purely material, continues to resonate. In their mystery and incompleteness, the Druids reveal something true about how we understand the past and how certain questions about meaning, spirituality, and the sacred remain relevant across vast spans of time. If you found yourself drawn into the world of ancient Druids and the Celtic mysteries they protected, please consider subscribing to History Scrolls for more explorations of the figures and civilizations that shaped our world. We uncover stories that history tried to bury and bring them back to light. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the mists of time.